My apologies. Just getting a little housekeeping here to get myself situated. Um, First, I want to thank you for the warm introduction, Jonathan, and on behalf of the United States government and the Department of Homeland Security, it is my great privilege to be with you at the World Summit on Counterterrorism and here in Herzliya. President Ganor, my friend, thank you for the invite and the partnership with the International Counterterrorism Institute, and thank you for your hospitality, my friend. This is a very important conference. It's important that we continue to have these conferences. As you know, the fight for terrorism has been global, and it's been global for decades. The stark examples in the United States on 9/11 were not the first time that we've addressed terrorism globally. I'm going to walk through my background a little bit, how I got into this position. I've got a few talking points. I'm going to go off the talking points a little bit to my Deputy Chief of Staff's probably nervousness over here, and talk about the history of terrorism, how we've evolved as a community globally, how the U.S. intelligence community and the Department of Homeland Security has evolved, and how our continued partnership is critical to the national security of all of our countries. And then I'm going to have some asks of you, too, as well. First, a little bit about my background. So 26 years in law enforcement, an intelligence officer, and an FBI agent. So a little bit about my background before I got this position was I started as a Houston police officer in Houston, Texas, almost 26 years ago. So a line police officer carrying a uniform, a gun, and a badge, for those of you who are familiar with U.S. law enforcement. Texas law enforcement is one riot, one ranger, in the sense of, you know Texas. The one thing about Texas is when I started there, it was the most violent crime city in the United States. We led the U.S. in homicides, aggravated robberies, robberies with a weapon, and aggravated assaults, assaults with people with a weapon as well. We had a very shortage of law enforcement officers in that time, so we were the fourth largest city, third largest by land mass. Some of the key takeaways, and I didn't know this at 21, 22 years old, but running calls for service and seeing the death and destruction burned into my head and how I would view the world today, on how so important it is to have intelligence, to be proactive, to predictive intelligence, to look for the leading indicators of violence. Houston was exploding in the late 80s and early 90s. For anyone who know about the U.S., is our narcotics epidemic, and that crack cocaine was proliferating. Houston, close to the U.S. border, had become greatly involved with transnational criminal organizations. I can use one call for an example, and I'll use a very stark example, and it's going to be relatively violent, but it's important for those of us that have worked in this line of profession. I was riding patrol one night, and I got a call of a shooting in progress. I arrived on scene at about 10:30 at night, and I saw a young male lying face up in a puddle of mud. Because we don't have any backup, I was the only officer running the call. I was waiting for a backup call. And I saw a young male, approximately 16 years old, that had a bullet right between his forehead. Now, unfortunately, in law enforcement and the military, this wasn't my first experience with death, or it wasn't my last experience to death, but it was my first experience. And because the shortage of personnel and resources, I sat there by myself and I watched this individual go through what we call the death rattles, that are guppy breathing, and he died right in front of me while giving first aid. What I kept going back to now, and I look at and his face is burned in my head, as well as other acts, and I'll talk about them further, is what could have we done? What could we do as a community? How do we create structures and institutions to find intelligence that could prevent a death? The worst day from happening in someone's life. The worst day from happening in a family's history. Following working in Houston for a police officer approximately 5 years, I was fortunate enough to transfer to Aurora, Colorado. For those of you familiar with the United States, Denver and Aurora are the two major cities, Denver, Colorado, where we ski. January 1st, 1997, I started there as a patrol officer. Again, I had the horrific experience being part of the Denver metropolitan area to our worst mass casualty school shooting in Columbine. I was part of our response mechanism in Denver, and Dylan Klebold and Eric Harris, for those of you who don't remember their name, probably you would not, if you're not from the U.S. area, those were the two individuals that conducted the attack. Now, it wasn't terrorism, but it was a violent extremist act where they had anchors in their social being that drove them to those attacks. Those two individuals that were high school students, and I'll just walk through the numbers, they had 100 explosive devices that caused, and multiple weapons that caused 13 deaths and 24 injuries. That was our first mark in the United States, and I would probably, I think, globally that really elevated the mass casualty shootings at schools. And unfortunately in the U.S., that was not going to be our last, as you've just seen in Parkland High School earlier this year. The aftermath, do we ask ourselves, what kind of proactive and predictive intelligence to identify those extremist acts, to identify those opportunities to interdict them through the private sector, through peer-to-peer network, through clergy, through families, through law enforcement? What do we have in place to do that? We are still trying to identify the mechanisms to identify those threat vectors and how to find that intelligence to find these at-risk individuals. They're going to use anchors to correct a violent act. This led me up to my final operational position where I became an FBI agent in the post-September 11th environment. My dream was to be an FBI agent. I was very fortunate that I've worked with many of our partners in this room throughout the world. My experience was developing a task force, a fusion center within the U.S. and our foreign partners to target the al-Shabaab threat, which was in the Horn of Africa, for those you remember, but also globally. We had a global transit mode of how individuals would transit to get into the terrorist training camps in Somalia. How we were partnering throughout the world on that to identify the networks, to collect the intelligence, and to target the groups through law enforcement, through the military, through partner nations in the Horn of Africa. But also what we learned too is the radicalization. We really started on the Somali threat and the al-Shabaab threat. How was this diaspora population radicalizing? What were some potential solutions for that through community engagement programs, and how we started to incorporate that in our being? It was really after that Somali diaspora, and we still had those after 9/11, but the Somali diaspora, and in partnership with their community, developing those programs in community institutions to help off-ramp those at-risk individuals. It struck home in the United States, for those of you who were working this, and I know many of you were. We had upwards of 50 young youth, some as young as 15 years old, traveling into the Horn of Africa to fight for al-Shabaab. They had a good way of life in the United States. At least we thought they did. But that was not the reality. Something drew them to leave Minneapolis, Minnesota, to leave Kansas City, Missouri, to leave Seattle, Washington, Washington, D.C., and their families, pack up everything and go in to fight for al-Shabaab in Somalia. What were those triggers? What were those indicators? What were the radicalization points? What could have we done different from a community policing, from a community outreach, from their peer network, from an individual? I mentioned I was a Houston police officer. Houston was one of the first cities in the United States that developed a community policing ideology along with the New York Police Department in Los Angeles. How did we take those lessons learned and help those at-risk individuals to identify those potential triggers that will lead to radicalization? So where am I at today? I currently serve as the Undersecretary for Intelligence in the Department of Homeland Security. What does that mean? So we are the third largest department in the United States government. We have 250,000 employees. I'm in charge of the entire intelligence enterprise of the organization. For those, I'll help a little bit with the names of what exactly we do. We're the United States Coast Guard. We're the United States Customs and Border Protection. For those that are trying to think, what is that? When you enter customs in the United States, you pass through the blue uniforms when you give your passport. In between the ports is Border Patrol. It's been in the news. You hear President Trump build the wall. That's Border Patrol, the green. And then in the air and the marine environment is the Office of Air and Marine, which are tan uniforms. We also have the National Protection and Programs Directorate. That also falls under the Department of Homeland Security. That is the critical infrastructure protection of our critical infrastructure sectors. How are we identifying the cyber threats to everything from finance to the electrical grids, power grids, to our elections, just to use the big ones that you're aware of. And also the Transportation Security Administration, essentially our aviation threats, how we are addressing our aviations and mass transit, which are prolific. Within this role, I am committed to restructuring and reorganizing the Department of Homeland Security to enable our entire organization in partnership with the intelligence community, law enforcement, our partners in the academic and community environment, as well as overseas, of how we are identifying threats, and from the U.S., and I would argue from your regions and countries as well, is how you're securing your border to identify those threats that are outside of your countries or regions and preventing them coming inside. How are we creating the structures within the U.S. government in partnership with you to identify those threats, to create an enterprise approach? It takes a new methodology, not new, but an improved and enhanced methodology in how we're doing that. But I'd like to walk through a little bit of the history of terrorist attacks in the United States. because it's important for us and for myself and for my colleagues. 26 years on my end. I'm actually relatively youthful as far as some of my others that have worked 30, 40, 50 years in this line of work. But the history is critical, and our key takeaways in that. Beirut Lebanon, 1983. 35 years ago, we experienced in the United States a massive terrorist attack, as well as our partner countries, many of you in this room. From a threat that our friends in Israel know very well, attacks by Lebanese Hezbollah. In 1983, U.S. servicemen were part of a multinational peacekeeping force in Lebanon, along with soldiers from the United Kingdom, Italy, and France. They protected the innocent and prevented civil war from becoming a greater tragedy. I know many of you remember this. In 1983, terrorists bombed the U.S. Embassy and killed 73 people. That was our first indicator. That was actually the stark indicator for the U.S. On October 23rd of the same year, Hezbollah detonated a truck bomb of over 4,000 kilograms of explosives outside the U.S. Marine Corps barracks. They killed 241 Americans who were soldiers, sailors, and Marines. A second truck bomb detonated seconds later, killing 58 French paratroopers at their installation. This marked the deadliest terrorist attack against the United States prior to September 11th, but we know it would not be our last. 1993, World Trade Center 1. Their first shot. Al-Qaeda targeted the World Trade Center February 26, 1993, detonating a large truck bomb. If you remember, it was in the parking garage. Their attempt was to crash the North Tower into the South Tower to bring down the World Trade Center. That failed, but the attack was successful. We had 6 people killed and over thousands injured. This was a wake-up call for the U.S. and a wake-up call around the world. Weren't quite there yet. Domestic terrorism. 1995, Oklahoma City. The Murrow Building. We're charged in the United States, in the Department of Homeland Security, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, our state and locals, to identify international and domestic terrorism. And I'm going to just pivot a little bit to domestic terrorism. This was relative to anarchist and white supremacist organizations. This is what domestic terrorism is. Oklahoma City, 1995. This was the first major domestic terrorism attack we had in the United States. Terry Nichols and Timothy McVeigh created a large truck bomb. They were motivated by many reasons, but specifically their anger towards the U.S. government and our policies and our operational actions against, I don't know if you remember these names, but Waco, Texas, and Ruby Ridge. Nichols and McVeigh conspired and others created a truck bomb, detonated at the Murrow Building, which is in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, killing 160 and wounding 680. At that time, it was the most lethal attack on the U.S. soil, and I believe we have some pictures here in Oklahoma City. Devastating. At this time, our resources were tailored towards threats that we faced in federal law enforcement. We began to start changing how we did business, how we're focused on threats, how we're focused on collecting intelligence, how we're bringing to bear the U.S. government, but primarily it was an FBI and CIA mission at the time. There was no Department of Homeland Security. To the Horn of Africa and Africa. 1998, the East Africa bombings in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, and Nairobi, Kenya, by Harun Fazul, Saleh Nabhan, and directed by Osama bin Laden. Again, we have pictures of that. 224 dead and over 4,500 injured. Another very stark example of terrorism, attacks, homeland and abroad. Warning indicators. USS Cole, again from the United States. October 12, 2000. Al-Qaeda struck with a small boat loaded with explosive on a U.S. destroyer, USS Cole, parked in Yemen's Aden Harbor. As you know, also 17 killed, 37 injured. There always are, and there always will be, intelligence indicators leading up to attacks. It's just a matter of how we posture our resources, how we are looking at that mission and integrating operations, intelligence, the community to look at these attack vectors, and are we posturing ourselves as an organization to identify them. Now, these are very operational. As I talked to the professor earlier, this is very operational mindset. This is from a strategic and tactical level, it's a very integrated approach to identify those threat vectors. But how are we changing the business we're doing as these threats are morphing? And I'll get to a further approach on that. Our goal was to break down the institutional barriers after 9/11. That was the beginning and of the Department of Homeland Security. Now, as I mentioned, 250,000 people strong, our biggest U.S. assets to protect the border. And the whole goal, my goal as the head of intelligence for the department and as the lead for the Homeland of the biggest organization, is to prevent foreign threats from coming to the United States. Not just terrorism, transnational criminal organization, foreign intelligence, cargo, narcotics. It's to repel that foreign threat. That requires and it's an overused term, a whole of government, a whole of partnership approach, because the threats are emerging and changing. The model that we are changing to incorporates the entire threat picture of how we're doing business, and I'll talk about that further. Central to the department is to build the wall, to build the barrier, and that's part to drive for lawful trade and travel. We want people, you want people, commerce, trade, travel, that's good, economic prosperity, but also we want safe trade and travel. How we get into the United States or get into your country requires border security, and it requires intense border security. We want the good people coming in. We want them coming in every day, as many that can come, both ways. We want good travel and trade. But we also want to fight those bad actors, those bad things coming in. Terrorists, proliferators, narcotics traffickers, human traffickers, child exploitation, all of that. It's a border security issue in partnership with you. How are we also doing that? It's courtesy of President Trump. He has signed an executive order of the one big thing is a national vetting center. The National Vetting Center in the United States brings together the intelligence, law enforcement resources under one hub under the Department of Homeland Security to identify the threats from a foreign space coming into the United States. Over the last decade and a half, as we've countered the terrorist threats, disruptive plots, and responded to attacks, we have continued to enhance our approach to counterterrorism, as I mentioned. However, the threat today continues to morph, evolve, and disperse. Morph, evolve, and disperse. We are more complex, more challenging, and geographically expansive. We know that. The individuals in this row knows that the threat is global, and our enterprise approach to how we identify the threats and create systems and structures to work towards mitigating it is critical. Thousands of foreign fighters from wars in Syria and Iraq, Afghanistan have returned to their home countries. We are extremely concerned, as you are, I know that, the dispersion of foreign fight works and their ability to establish new networks and conduct operations, either attacks, recruitment, or their virtual radicalization network. How are we going to posture to do that? The challenging we're having right now. Every country has a responsibility to rehabilitate and prosecute their citizens who have been captured or returned from the battlefield. We have that responsibility. I know I've spoken to many of you in the past and today, but that responsibility, if we have foreign citizens of our citizenship that are now in the battlefield or in detention, we have to find a way to prosecute or to de-radicalize or to enable them to return into our communities. But we have to find up with the policy and strategy solutions to do that. I know firsthand how hard that is to do as an FBI agent, how to prosecute individuals you capture outside of your countries or they're arrested outside of your countries, and how these violent extremists or de-radicalization programs and community engagements are. But we have to find solutions. We have to find solutions. We remain concerned about the sophisticated terrorism threat. The aviation threat is not going away. The aviation threat is not going away. ISIS and Al-Qaeda remain determined to strike aircraft. They are determined. We have also have to contend with what we've labeled the lone wolves. I heard the professor speak about this at length on my last visit to Israel. ISIS has improved their ability to inspire individuals operating overseas to act alone or in their own environment, using knives, you know this, small arms, vehicles, improvised explosive devices that are readily available online. Easily can find that online. These individuals are encouraged not to travel to the war zones, but to conduct attack on their homeland, their home country. Another threat, the use of unmanned aerial vehicles, drones. Drones are already an attack vector that are upon us. This threat is upon us. We know terrorist organizations have used them. We know they are planning to use them, and it is real. How we create those countermeasures and legislation or legal authorities to identify those threats are critical. I would also say drones are not unique for terrorist organizations. I'd be remiss to say that narcotics smuggling, transnational criminal organizations, and other actors are using drones for all sorts of nefarious activities. We just had prison officials in here. We know that drones are using cell phones to be smuggled in prisons in the United States, dropping them over the fence line. Absolutely know that's occurring. Drones are a real threat. Some of the triggers and what we've identified in the behavioral analysis of our violent extremists in the United States. I know, Professor, again, we've talked about this. But that societal aspect, that these individuals are not assimilated into our cultural norms of right and wrong. There is an aspect of self-hate and anger towards themselves. They are not integrated into our current social or economic structure. They are grasping for an ideology, and at times any ideology, based on their hate, to express their anger and to use it as an anchor to strike out. I was recently in Las Vegas and met with the sheriff. So if those of you know, we had a massive shooting in October last year in Las Vegas, Nevada, and talking about those triggers and indicators from what occurred in that shooting. Not going into the specifics of the case, which would be inappropriate, but looking at what were those anchors, what were those motivating factors that drove an individual could create a mass shooting. Terrorist ideology and support for violence provides an outlet for this anger, the hatred towards social, political, and economic grievances. It gives that anchor for hate to strike. How do we identify that and off-ramp that? It's going to create, and again, it's a whole of community how we do that. And law enforcement is the last, to me, is the last resort or the last failure after we're arresting him. How do we identify that radical, violent behavior before it occurs? The virtual world today has clearly accelerated extremist acts as the social environment becomes virtual, and it provides insulation for the extremist ideology. It has blunted some of our best tools to prevent violent activity, to identify it and to prevent it, against our radicalization tools, our peer-to-peer community, our community policing and our community centers to identify those at-risk individuals, very similar to our gang programs in the 80s and 90s that I worked. How do we change that model to go after that virtual online radicalization? It's a different model of terrorism. In the last year, I want to be very specific about this. Iran's malign influence. Finally, Iran remains the most prominent state sponsor of terrorism and serves as a central bank for specific international terrorist organizations. They provide financial aid and advanced weapons and tactics to terrorists across the Middle East, including continued support to Lebanese Hezbollah. They cultivate a global network of operatives as a contingency to enable and to direct potential terror attacks. Earlier, I spoke of the 1983 bombings against the U.S. Marine barracks. These attacks were perpetrated by Lebanese Hezbollah, an organization founded by Iran, which maintains its terrorist activity. It continues to serve as a proxy for Iran. President Trump has put Iran on notice that we will no longer tolerate their destabilizing activities, cyber warfare, efforts to cause social unrest and political instability, nor their support of terrorism across the region and the world. As President Trump has said, there will be consequences for Iran's malign activity, and those actions will not be tolerated. Terrorism is not new. Emerging technologies, encrypted communications, and finally home propaganda challenge our ability to keep our citizens and allies safe. In order to mitigate these threats, we have changed to a mission-centered approach in the Department of Homeland Security, and it mirrors what we've changed in the U.S. government and the U.S. intelligence community. That is aligning our strategic, our policy, our intelligence, and our operations into a centered approach. Terrorism, transnational organized crime, foreign influence, counterintelligence, economic trade and finance, and transnational organized crime under the Department of Homeland Security. The unique mission centers that will align with the the Director of National Intelligence, as well as the entire U.S. intelligence enterprise. My statutory charge is to integrate that with our state, local, and private sectors. So information sharing with the local law enforcement, with the private sector, resides upon me and my statutory authorities in the organization. So it is essential how we align across the enterprise in a mission-centered approach to identify these threats and to create strategies and solutions in an integrated approach. In addition, these mission centers allow us to be fluid and adaptable to the threats, as the terrorism threat may or may not go up or down, the foreign intelligence threat may go up or down, the threats to critical infrastructure may go up or down, or transnational crime. It allows us to move resources and strategies and policies and planning and intelligence and operations across the threat spectrum, as they are more corporate than just terrorism. I'd be remiss to say it wasn't just more than terrorism. This is our ability to be adaptable. But the key to that is our partners and our friendships, how we create a global partnership on these items of mutual interest. In order to mitigate threats today, in order to the future, our interpartionals is critical, as I mentioned, and we will continue to rely on our friends and allies for that close cooperation. The threats are evolving, the threats are real, and we must mitigate them together. In the fight against terrorism, the United States is committed to confront these threats together in partnership with you. And thank you for letting me take this opportunity to speak to you.